I'm standing in my uncle's living room holding a champagne flute I didn't ask for, surrounded by family members who are laughing and congratulating each other. And my Uncle Raymond stands at the fireplace like he's giving a corporate presentation, his voice booming as he announces that he's secured a $210 million exit for all of us. That after months of careful negotiation, he's brought home the deal of a lifetime. And everyone applauds. Actually applauds like we're at a shareholder meeting instead of a family gathering. And champagne corks pop and people hug. And my cousin is crying happy tears. And I'm watching all of this happen while my mind races because I haven't signed anything. Nobody has asked me to review documents. Nobody has consulted me about terms or timing or structure. And yet here's my uncle announcing a done deal, a secured exit, money already counted and distributed in his mind. And he catches my eye across the room and raises his glass toward me with that confident smile he always wears when he's gotten his way. And he says loudly so everyone can hear that we just need a few final signatures. Just formalities, really. Nothing substantial, just crossing T's and dotting I's, and everyone nods. Like that makes perfect sense. Like signatures on a $200 million deal are just paperwork, just administrative details. And I stand there with my champagne growing warm in my hand, and I don't drink it, and I don't smile. And I realize that my uncle has just announced to our entire family that my consent is guaranteed, that my signature is a formality, that my agreement is assumed, and nobody in this room, not one person, has considered that I might not sign. Let me tell you who I am because the story my uncle tells doesn't include this version. My name is Isabel Crane, I'm 51 years old, and I'm the co-founder of the company everyone is celebrating, the company that's being sold for $210 million. And when I say co-founder, I don't mean I contributed ideas or helped out occasionally. I mean I built the core technology, I developed the original algorithms, I spent 3 years in a basement office writing code while my uncle handled business development. And we were supposed to be partners, equal partners. That's what the original operating agreement said. But over the years, Raymond's role expanded and mine contracted in the family narrative. He started speaking for both of us, started representing the company at events, started being the face while I remained the engine. And I let it happen because I'm not comfortable with attention. I'm methodical and quiet. I prefer building things to presenting them. And Raymond is charismatic and confident and good at telling stories. So it made sense to let him handle external relationships while I focused on product. Except somewhere along the way, the story became that he built the company and I helped, that he was the visionary and I was technical support, that he negotiated and led and saved us while I did background work. And I never corrected that narrative because it didn't seem important. The company was successful, we were making money, the partnership was working. But now standing in this room, hearing him announce an exit I didn't agree to, I understand that the narrative matters. The story people believe about who did what determines who has power. And right now, everyone believes Raymond has the authority to make this deal. And this deal affects my entire future. Raymond corners me after the toast, pulling me into his home office away from the celebrating family, and he closes the door and his demeanor changes immediately. The public warmth replaced by business focus. And he tells me the buyers are impatient. They want signatures by Monday. They've made an exceptional offer, and any delay could make them reconsider. And he slides a folder across his desk toward me, thick with documents. And he says I just need to sign where the tabs are marked. Nothing complicated, just consent forms and transfer paperwork. And I ask if I can take these home to review, and he looks irritated. Says there's nothing to review. It's all standard sale documentation. And besides, the lawyers already vetted everything. And I ask which lawyers, and he says our lawyers, the company lawyers, and I realize he means lawyers he hired, lawyers who work for him, not lawyers who represent my interests specifically. And he's watching me with this careful expression, and he says, Isabel, don't complicate this. We've been working toward this exit for years. And I want to ask what he means by we, because I didn't know we were working toward an exit. I thought we were building a sustainable company. But before I can speak, my husband Andrew appears in the doorway, And Raymond waves him in, and Andrew puts his hand on my shoulder and says, "Honey, Raymond knows what he's doing. We should trust his judgment." And I realize they've already discussed this, already agreed that I need to be managed. And Raymond says the family is counting on this. And I look between them, understanding that they've already promised my consent to someone, already guaranteed my signature, and now they're pressuring me to fulfill a commitment I never made. I take the folder home, despite Raymond's protests, and I sit at my kitchen table after Andrew goes to bed, and I go through every page slowly, carefully, and the deal structure gradually becomes clear. $210 million total purchase price, divided among stakeholders according to equity percentages. Except when I find the breakdown of distributions, my portion is noticeably smaller than I expected, significantly smaller. And there's a footnote explaining that certain shares were reclassified 3 years ago during a restructuring. I barely remember. A restructuring Raymond handled while I was focused on product development. And apparently that reclassification reduced my equity percentage from 45% to 32%. And I sit there staring at this number, trying to remember signing anything that would authorize such a change. And I can't. I have no memory of agreeing to give up 13% of the company. And I keep reading, and I find that Raymond's percentage increased correspondingly. His shares now represent 53% majority control. And I do the math. At 32%, my payout is $67 million. Still substantial, still life-changing. But Raymond's payout at 53% is $111 million. And there's a section explaining that the difference accounts for his leadership role, his negotiation work, his business development efforts over the years. And the document calls this distribution fair and equitable. And I sit back in my chair thinking about that word fair, wondering who decided what fair means, wondering how taking 13% of my equity without my clear consent and giving it to someone else qualifies as fair. And I realize this deal isn't just about selling the company. It's about finalizing a transfer of ownership and credit that's been happening gradually for years. And Raymond is trying to lock it in permanently. And fair only means fair to the person who benefits. Over the next few days, the family narrative solidifies. I hear it repeated at Sunday dinner, at my mother's house, in phone calls from my sister. The same story told the same way. Raymond negotiated this deal. Raymond led us to this exit. Raymond saved the company from stagnation. And my role in these retellings gets smaller and smaller. I'm mentioned as someone who helped with technology, who supported Raymond's vision, who contributed in the early days, and it's subtle but consistent, this rewriting of history. And I start to notice that Raymond has been telling this version for a while, maybe years, preparing the ground so that when this moment came, everyone would already believe he deserved the larger share, deserved the credit, deserved the authority. And my sister calls and says, "Isn't it amazing what Raymond accomplished?" And I ask what specifically she thinks he accomplished. And she lists things, the acquisition talks, the deal structure, the negotiation, all things that happened in the last 6 months. And I ask about the previous 12 years, about who built the technology that made the company valuable. And she goes quiet and says, "Well, obviously you did the technical work, Isabel, but Raymond made it into a business." And I realize this is the division they've accepted. I made something, and Raymond made it matter. I was the builder, and he was the leader. And in that framework, my contribution is foundational, but his is essential. And I'm listening to my sister explain why Raymond deserves more credit and more money for work he did in 6 months than I deserve for work I did over 12 years. And I want to argue, but I realize arguing won't help, because the narrative is set, the story is told, and changing it would require proving my version. And the only way to prove my version is through documentation, through the original agreements, through the paper trail that shows what really happened. And I thank my sister for her call, and I hang up, and I start looking for those old documents. Raymond calls me on Thursday evening, and his voice has an edge I've rarely heard. And he says we have 48 hours to finalize signatures. The buyers are getting nervous. Any further delay could kill the deal entirely. And he reminds me what's at stake. $67 million for me, financial security for life. And all I have to do is sign. And I ask, why the rush? Why can't we take a few more days to review? And he says, because that's not how these deals work. Because timing matters. Because hesitation signals doubt, and doubt makes buyers reconsider. And he tells me he spent 6 months building trust with these people, 6 months negotiating terms, and I'm jeopardizing everything by overthinking. And I say I'm not overthinking, I'm reading, and there's a long silence. And he asks what exactly I'm reading, and I tell him I'm reviewing the original operating agreement, the equity structures, the amendments, and I can hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and he says, those are ancient documents, irrelevant now, superseded by the restructuring. And I ask when exactly that restructuring happened. What date? And he gives me a date 3 years ago, May 15th, and I write it down because I'm going to find the documents from that restructuring and I'm going to see what I actually agreed to. And Raymond says, Isabel, you're making this complicated when it should be simple. And I say, $200 million is never simple. And he says 48 hours, and I need your signature Monday morning. And I say, I don't rush into decisions this big. And he says, you don't have a choice. And I say, actually, I do. And I hang up. And I sit there thinking about his words. You don't have a choice. And I realize that's what he believes. That's what he's been counting on. That when pressure came, I would fold. I would sign. I would defer to his authority like I've deferred for years. But I'm not deferring anymore. I'm reading. I spend the weekend reading every document I can find. Old operating agreements, board meeting minutes, email chains from years ago, and I'm looking for something specific. Any language about decision-making authority, about who can negotiate on behalf of the company, about what requires unanimous consent versus majority approval, and late Saturday night I find it, buried in the purchase agreement Raymond gave me. Section 7, subsection 4, language about voting rights. And it says that upon execution of this agreement, all voting power for shares represented herein transfers immediately to the acquiring entity pending final closing. Which means the moment I sign this document, I lose the ability to vote my shares, I lose governance authority, and the acquiring company takes control even before money changes hands. And I read it 3 times to make sure I understand. And I do understand this isn't just a sale agreement, it's a transfer of control. And once signed, my equity becomes non-voting, becomes passive, becomes subject to decisions made by others. And I keep reading and I find another section, Section 12, about governance transition. And it specifies that former stakeholders will have no board representation, no operational input, no decision-making authority after closing, which is standard for most acquisitions, except this deal hasn't closed yet. The voting transfer happens at signature, not at closing. And that's unusual, that's a red flag. And I realize why Raymond wants signatures fast, why he's pushing so hard for Monday. Because the moment everyone signs, he gains complete control, even before the money arrives. He becomes the sole decision maker. And if something changes in the deal terms, if the buyers revise their offer, if problems emerge, I'll have no vote, no voice, no power to object. And this isn't just an exit, this is erasure. This is Raymond removing me from any future decisions about a company I built. And I sit back from my computer screen, and I understand what's happening, and I'm not signing anything yet. The family pressure intensifies on Sunday. My mother calls saying I'm being difficult. My sister texts asking why I can't just trust Raymond, and Andrew, my own husband, tells me I'm overthinking again. That I always do this. Make simple things complicated. And I ask him if he's read the documents, and he says he doesn't need to. Raymond handled it, and I ask if it concerns him that I'm getting significantly less equity than I started with. And he says Raymond explained that it's fair compensation for his work. And I realize Andrew has been talking to Raymond more than he's been talking to me, has been getting Raymond's version of events, Raymond's explanations, and he's accepted all of it without question. And when I try to explain the voting rights issue, try to show him the language about immediate transfer of control, Andrew sighs and says, I'm looking for problems that don't exist. And I ask him whose side he's on, and he says there shouldn't be sides. We're family. And I realize that's the framework they're all using. Family means unity. Unity means agreement, and my questions are treated as family disloyalty rather than reasonable business caution. And at Sunday dinner, Raymond makes a comment loud enough for everyone to hear about how some people struggle with change, how some people get anxious about transitions, and everyone nods sympathetically. And I understand he's framing my hesitation as emotional instability, as fear of change rather than legitimate business concern. And my mother says change is hard for you, Isabel. You've always needed time to adjust, and I'm sitting there being psychoanalyzed by people who haven't read the contract, being told my perfectly rational questions about a $200 million deal are actually emotional issues, anxiety problems, adjustment difficulties. And the message is clear: sign the papers, trust Raymond, stop causing problems. And I look around the table at my family, at people I love, and I realize they're choosing his story over mine. They're choosing to believe I'm difficult, rather than consider that he might be manipulating them. And trust has already been spent. They spent it on him, and I have none left to spend. I make a quiet decision Monday morning. Instead of signing, I request historical documents. I email Raymond asking for the complete archive, original operating agreement, all amendments, all side letters, any documents that modified equity structures or governance, and I frame it as due diligence, just wanting to make sure everything is in order before I sign. And Raymond responds within an hour saying that's unnecessary. The lawyers have everything. But I push back and say I want my own copies, and he sends them. Probably because refusing would look suspicious, would make the family wonder why he won't share documents. And the files arrive Monday afternoon, dozens of PDFs. And I start reading systematically, and nobody thinks this is dangerous. Raymond certainly doesn't think it's dangerous. He thinks I'm being thorough, maybe annoying, maybe overly cautious, but not dangerous. He believes the documents support his version, support the restructuring, support his increased equity. And I read through operating agreements and board minutes and email chains, and I'm looking for something specific. I'm looking for the moment when my equity changed, the moment when 45% became 32%. And I'm looking for my signature, for my explicit consent. And I read the restructuring documents from 3 years ago, May 15th, the date Raymond gave me, and I find the amendment, the equity reallocation, the specific changes. And I find signatures, Raymond's signature, our lawyer's signature, board approval. Everything looks proper, everything looks official. Except my signature isn't there. There's a line for it, a designated space, but it's blank, unsigned, and there's a note in the margin: Isabel Crane consent pending, verbal approval confirmed. And I stare at that note, verbal approval confirmed, and I have no memory of giving verbal approval, no memory of agreeing to reduce my equity. And I start checking other documents, looking for anything else with my signature missing, and I find 3 more amendments, all equity related, all with the same note, verbal approval confirmed, and I realize what happened. Raymond restructured the company without my written consent, without my signature, based on claimed verbal agreements I never made, and he built an entire new equity structure on a foundation that doesn't exist. I sit with this discovery for a full day, not telling anyone, not reacting, just thinking through implications. And I realize something chilling. Everyone in my family, everyone in this deal process, has been operating on an assumption. They assume Raymond had authority to negotiate on my behalf, to represent my interests, to make decisions about my equity. And they assume this because Raymond told them so, because he's been handling business development, because he's the public face, because he speaks confidently and acts like he has authority. But I start going back further, back to the original documents, the real original documents from 12 years ago when we founded the company, and I find the operating agreement we both signed, and Section 3 is very clear. It says any transfer of equity, any change to ownership percentages, any modification of governance structure requires written consent from all founding members. Written, not verbal. And founding members means Raymond and me, both of us, and all means unanimous. And I read that section 5 times to make sure I understand, and I do understand, every equity change Raymond made over the past 3 years. Every restructuring, every amendment, all of it required my written signature, and he never got it. He proceeded based on claimed verbal approvals that aren't documented anywhere, that I don't remember giving. And legally, those changes might not be valid. The restructuring might not be binding. And if the restructuring isn't binding, then my equity percentage never changed. I still own 45%, not 32%. And Raymond's authority to negotiate on my behalf, his authority to make decisions, his authority to announce this deal, all of it might be built on a foundation that legally doesn't exist. And without my signature, without my actual written consent, this deal stalls. The buyers can't get clear title, can't be certain they're purchasing valid shares, and everything Raymond has built, all his negotiation work, all his deal structure, all his promises to family, all of it depends on me signing. And he doesn't have authority to make me, and I realize the power dynamic just shifted. Raymond just doesn't know it yet. I find the clause Tuesday afternoon, buried in the original operating agreement, Section 8, Subsection 2, and it's about intellectual property. And it says, any sale or transfer of company assets that includes proprietary technology requires individual consent from equity holders who contributed said intellectual property. And there's a list of qualifying contributions. And my algorithm work is listed specifically, by name, my code architecture, my data processing methods, all explicitly named as requiring my individual consent for any sale. And I read this clause over and over because it's absolute, it's not negotiable, it's not subject to majority vote. It says individual consent, which means my signature isn't a formality, it's a requirement, it's a veto. And without it, the deal can't close because the buyers are purchasing the technology. That's what makes the company valuable. That's what they're paying $210 million for, and they can't acquire that technology without my explicit written consent. And I realize this clause is exactly what I needed. It's protection I didn't know I had. It's power I didn't realize existed. And I check the date on this agreement, verify it's the executed version, verify it was never amended or superseded, and it wasn't. This clause is still active, still binding, still enforceable. And I sit back in my chair and I think about Raymond announcing a secure deal, announcing guaranteed signatures, announcing my consent as a formality, and I think about how wrong he is. How completely he misunderstood the legal structure. How he assumed his restructuring gave him control when legally it might not exist. And I think about calling him, about explaining what I found, but I don't. Not yet, because information is power, and revealing what I know gives away advantage. So I stay quiet and I keep reading and I prepare. The buyers request clarification Wednesday morning. Their lawyers email Raymond with questions about equity structure, asking for documentation of all amendments, asking for signatures on restructuring documents, and Raymond forwards me the email with a terse message. They need complete documentation. Please confirm you have no objections to the equity structure as presented. And I read his email carefully. And I notice he's not asking me to sign anything specific. He's asking me to confirm no objections, which is different, which would be verbal approval. Exactly the kind of verbal approval he's been using to justify changes I never agreed to. And I respond very carefully. I write, I'm reviewing all documentation thoroughly. Will respond to specific requests in writing once my review is complete. And I don't confirm anything, don't agree to anything, don't give him any statement he can characterize as approval. And an hour later, Raymond calls, his voice tight, controlled, angry, and he says, the buyers are getting nervous. They need confirmation that equity structure is solid. And I ask what specifically they're concerned about, and he admits they found inconsistencies in the documentation, missing signatures on amendments, and they want to verify all changes were properly authorized. And I can hear panic underneath his control. Very quiet, but definitely there. And I say that seems reasonable. They should verify everything. And Raymond says, Isabel, I need you to tell me right now. Are you going to sign or not? And I say, I'm still reviewing. And he says, that's not an answer. And I say, it's the only answer I have right now. And he hangs up without saying goodbye. And 20 minutes later, I get an email from the buyer's attorney addressed to me directly for the first time, requesting a meeting to discuss my consent rights under the operating agreement, and I realize the buyers did their own legal review, found the same clause I found, understood that my signature isn't just helpful, it's required. And they're going around Raymond now, coming to me directly, and Raymond's control of this process just crumbled. Raymond tells the family I'm jeopardizing everything. He calls an emergency meeting Thursday evening, gathers everyone at my mother's house, and he stands in the living room explaining that the deal is at risk because I'm refusing to sign, because I'm asking questions that create doubt, because I'm making the buyers nervous with my delays and reviews, and he frames it as me versus the family, my stubbornness versus everyone's financial security. And he says if this deal falls apart, it's on me. $67 million for me, $40 million for my sister, $30 million for my mother, all of it gone, because I can't just trust the process. And my mother actually cries, asks why I'm doing this to them. And my sister says I'm being selfish, thinking only of myself. And Andrew, my husband, sides with Raymond publicly, tells the family that I've always been stubborn, always had to do things my own way. And he apologizes to Raymond for my behavior. Actually apologizes on my behalf, like I'm a child who needs managing. And I sit there listening to my family blame me, accuse me, paint me as the villain in Raymond's story, and I don't defend myself, don't argue, don't try to explain about missing signatures and invalid restructuring and verbal approvals that never happened, because they won't hear it. They're too invested in Raymond's version, too excited about the money, too certain that he's the hero and I'm the obstacle. And Raymond looks at me across the room with this expression of controlled fury. And he says, "Isabel, you're hurting people you claim to love." And I look back at him and I say very quietly, "I'm protecting myself." And he says, "From what?" And I say, "From you." And the room goes completely silent. And Andrew stands up and says, "We should go." And I realize he means we should leave. I'm being removed from the family meeting, dismissed for not cooperating. And I stand up and I walk out. And I hear my sister say she's always been difficult. And I get in my car alone because Andrew is staying with them, staying with Raymond. And I drive home and I stay calm because staying calm is the only power I have left. Raymond meets me alone Friday morning, shows up at my house unannounced, and Andrew lets him in before I can object. And Raymond sends Andrew away and closes the door. And the charm is completely gone now. The uncle warmth disappeared. And he looks at me with cold calculation and he says, "We need to end this." And I ask what this is. And he says, "Your resistance, your questions, your delay." And he sits down across from me and he drops any pretense of family concern. And he says, "Isabel, you don't want to be remembered like this. You don't want to be the person who destroyed everyone's opportunity because of stubbornness." And I say, "I'm not being stubborn. I'm being careful." And he says, "Careful about what? I've given you a $67 million exit. What more do you want?" And I look at him and I say, "I want what's actually mine." And he goes very still. And I say, "I've been reviewing the original operating agreement, the real one, not the restructured version." And he says, "The restructuring is legal, it's binding." And I say, "Is it? Because I don't remember signing it." And he says, "I gave verbal approval." And I say, "Show me where I agreed to reduce my equity by 13%. Show me documentation." And he says, "It's in the board minutes, verbal approval confirmed." And I say, "Verbal approval isn't sufficient. The operating agreement requires written consent." And he stares at me, and I can see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I know, how much I've discovered. And he pivots, changes approach, and he says, "Even if there were procedural irregularities, the restructuring served everyone's interests. It positioned the company for this exact exit." And I say, "It positioned you for a larger payout at my expense." And he says, "I did the work, I earned it." And I say, "Maybe, but you didn't get my signature. And without my signature, those changes aren't valid." And he says, "You're threatening me." And I say, "No, I'm stating facts." And he leans forward and he says, "You don't want to fight me on this, Isabel, you'll lose." And I say, "Actually, I don't think I will." And he asks what I want. What would make me sign? And I realize he's negotiating now, no longer demanding. And I tell him the truth. I want accurate equity percentages. I want proper documentation. I want honest answers about what happened 3 years ago. And he goes silent, completely silent. And I know I'm right. I tell Raymond I know he negotiated deal terms that transferred my voting rights before payout. I tell him I found Section 7, subsection 4. I tell him I understand that the moment I sign, I lose all governance authority even before closing. And I ask him to explain why he structured it that way, why he needs to strip my voting power immediately. And he goes silent, absolutely silent. And the silence stretches between us 30 seconds, 40, a full minute. And he doesn't answer, doesn't defend, doesn't explain. And his silence is confirmation, is admission, and I realize he can't justify it because there's no legitimate justification. The only reason to structure a deal that way is to take control, to eliminate my voice, to make sure I can't object to anything that happens after signature. And I think about what could happen after signature, what changes might occur, what deal terms might shift, and I realize Raymond has been planning for contingencies, planning for scenarios where he might need to modify the agreement without my approval. And he needed my voting rights gone first, needed me powerless first. And I ask him, what else is in this deal that I don't know about? What other terms exist? And he says everything is disclosed. And I say, I don't believe you. And he actually stands up like he's gonna leave. And I say, you're not going anywhere until you tell me the truth. And he turns back and his face is different now, harder. And he says, the truth is you're out of your depth. Isabel, you don't understand how these deals work. You don't understand negotiation. You don't understand that sometimes you have to give things up to get things done. And I say, I understand that you've been making decisions without my consent, and I understand that stops now. And he asks what I'm going to do. And I say, I'm going to talk to the buyers. I'm going to explain that certain consents haven't been properly obtained. And Raymond's face goes pale. The acquiring firm contacts me directly that afternoon. Their lead attorney requests a video call, and I accept. And she's professional and direct. And she says they've discovered some documentation issues, missing signatures on equity amendments, and they need clarity about whether the current equity structure is valid. And I appreciate her directness, appreciate that she's not dancing around the issue. And I tell her the truth. I tell her I never signed the restructuring documents, never gave written consent to reduce my equity percentage. And the changes Raymond implemented might not be legally binding. And she makes notes, asks specific questions about the original operating agreement, about the intellectual property clause, about my contribution to the company's core technology, and I answer everything honestly, send her the relevant documents, and she thanks me and says they'll need to pause the deal pending legal review. And I say I understand. And she says, Miss Crane, I want to be clear. The buyers are still interested in acquiring your company, but we need clean title, we need valid equity structure, we need certainty about what we're purchasing. And I say that's reasonable. And she says Raymond has presented himself as having full authority to negotiate, but our review suggests that's not accurate. And I say, no, it's not accurate. And she asks if I'm willing to discuss terms directly with their team. And I say, yes, I am. And she says, good, we'll be in touch. And after the call, I sit very still because something fundamental just changed. The buyers aren't working through Raymond anymore. They're working with me. They understand I have consent rights they need, and Raymond's control of this process is ending. And he's going to realize very soon that his authority was never as complete as he believed. And I feel something like satisfaction. Not revenge, not victory, just the quiet satisfaction of being heard, of being recognized as a decision maker rather than a signature that rubber stamps someone else's choices. Everything freezes over the weekend, the deal timeline stops, the Monday deadline passes without signatures, and lawyers enter the process in force. The buyer's legal team, my newly retained attorney, and Raymond's counsel all coordinating to understand what's valid and what isn't. And I watch Raymond lose control of the room in real time. He calls me Saturday, trying to coordinate our response, trying to present a unified front. And I tell him we're not unified, we have different interests, different positions, and I've retained my own representation. And he says that's unnecessary, we're on the same side. And I say we've never been on the same side. Raymond, you've been on your side. And Sunday my attorney calls with preliminary analysis, and she says the restructuring documents are problematic, missing signatures, insufficient consent, potentially voidable, and the original equity percentages might still be in effect, which means I likely own 45%, not 32%, and Raymond likely owns 38%, not 53%. And if that's true, then he never had majority control, never had authority to negotiate unilaterally, and everything he's done for 6 months has been procedurally invalid. And my attorney asks if I want to void the restructuring, enforce the original agreement. And I think about it carefully, think about whether I want to fight that battle, and I say, let's see what the buyers propose first. Let's understand what clean deal structure looks like. And Monday morning, the buyer's attorney sends a revised proposal. New terms, new structure, new distribution. And I open the document and I read carefully, and my share has increased dramatically from 67 million to 94 million. And Raymond's share has decreased from 111 million to 79 million. And the voting rights transfer has been removed, and governance protections have been added. And I read this proposal understanding it's based on original equity percentages, based on valid documentation, based on what can actually be legally enforced. And I call my attorney and I say, this is better, this is fair. And she says the buyers want to move quickly, if you'll agree. And I say I need Raymond to see this first, and she forwards it to his counsel. And 20 minutes later, Raymond calls me and he's furious. The family dynamics shift within hours. Suddenly people want to hear my concerns. My mother calls asking what's really happening. My sister sends a careful text saying she didn't understand the full situation. And Andrew, my husband, actually apologizes, says he should have listened to me, should have taken my questions seriously instead of dismissing them. And I appreciate the apology, but I don't fully accept it yet, because apologies without changed behavior don't mean much. And I need to see if Andrew actually changes, if he actually starts treating me as an equal rather than someone who needs to be managed. And my mother asks me to explain what happened, and I walk her through it. The missing signatures, the invalid restructuring, the consent rights I have. And she's quiet for a long time. And she says Raymond told us he had everything handled. And I say he thought he did. He convinced himself his verbal approvals were sufficient, but legally they weren't. And my sister calls and admits she didn't read any documents. She just believed Raymond when he said everything was finalized. And I realize my family isn't malicious. They're just trusting. They believed Raymond because he's confident and articulate, and he told a good story. And they didn't question, because questioning felt like disloyalty. And now they're shocked to learn the story wasn't complete, wasn't accurate, wasn't honest. And they're apologizing to me in careful voices, asking if I'm okay, asking what happens next. And I tell them the buyers proposed revised terms, better terms, more accurate terms, and everyone will still get substantial payouts, just not quite as much as Raymond originally announced. And my mother says, so the deal is still happening. And I say yes if I agree to it. And she says, will you? And I say I'm considering it. I'm reviewing carefully. And she says, Isabel, we should have listened to you. And I say, yes, you should have. And that acknowledgement, that simple admission, means more than any apology. The revised offer arrives formally on Tuesday, complete proposal, new deal structure, corrected equity percentages, and my share is 94.5 million, reflecting 45% ownership. And Raymond's share is 79.8 million, reflecting 38%, and my sister gets 28 million. My mother gets 7 million, exactly proportional to actual equity held. And the governance terms are completely different. No immediate voting transfer, board seats maintained through closing, consent required for any deal modifications, protective language ensuring stakeholders retain authority until funds transfer. And I read every page carefully, every clause, every provision, and this structure is clean, honest, enforceable, and I call my attorney and I say this reflects reality. And she says, yes, it does. And she says the buyers are firm on these terms. They won't negotiate based on Raymond's previous structure because they don't believe it's valid. And I say I agree with them. And she asks if I'm prepared to sign. And I say almost. I have one call to make first. And I call Raymond and he answers immediately. And his voice is tight with controlled rage. And he says, this is unacceptable. The revised terms are insulting. I negotiated a better deal. And I say, you negotiated a deal based on equity you didn't actually have. And he says those restructuring documents are binding. And I say, show me my signature, Raymond. Show me where I agreed. And he can't. And I say, the buyers are being generous. 79 million is substantial. And he says it should be 111. That's what I earned. And I say, you earned what you actually negotiated with proper authority, nothing more. And he says, I brought this deal together. I made this happen. And I say, yes, and you'll be compensated well for it, just not at my expense. And he's silent, breathing hard. And finally, he says, you're doing this to punish me. And I say, no, I'm doing this to protect myself. There's a difference. And he says, the family will never forgive you. And I say, the family already knows the truth, Raymond. They know about the missing signatures. They know about the invalid restructuring. They know you made promises you couldn't keep. And his fury is palpable, even through the phone. Raymond makes one last attempt Wednesday evening, shows up at my house again, and this time I don't let him in. We talk on the front porch, and he's dropped all pretense now. No charm, no family warmth, just desperate calculation. And he begs me to sign the original deal, the one with his larger share. And he says we can do it quietly, just between us. We can tell the buyers I agreed to the restructuring retroactively, and everything goes back to his version. And he says this is about more than money, Isabel. This is about peace, about family harmony. And I say family harmony built on lies isn't harmony. And he says, please, I'm asking you as family, sign the original terms. And I look at him and I say, you already took yours, Raymond. You already calculated your payout at 111 million, already made plans, already spent it mentally, and now you can't accept having less. And he says, I earned that money. I worked for 6 months on this deal, and I say I worked for 12 years building the technology that made the deal possible. So tell me again about earning. And he's quiet. And then he pivots one more time, and he says, money isn't everything, Isabel. Relationships matter. Family matters. And I say, you're right. Family does matter. That's why I'm not letting you cheat me anymore. And he actually flinches at the word cheat. And he says, I never cheated you. And I say, you restructured my equity without my signature. You reduced my percentage without my consent. You built a deal that stripped my voting rights. You told the family I was being difficult when I asked reasonable questions. You tried to pressure me into signing documents I hadn't reviewed. So tell me, Raymond, what would you call that, if not cheating? And he stares at me and he has no answer, and I say I'm signing the revised terms tomorrow. And if you want your 79 million, you'll sign too. And he says, this isn't over. And I say, yes, it is. And I close the door and I watch through the window as he walks to his car. And I understand something clearly. Raymond's power was always borrowed, always based on my willingness to let him lead. And the moment I stopped willing, his power disappeared. I sign Thursday morning, but not the document Raymond expects. I execute my consent under the revised terms only, the structure that reflects actual equity percentages, the terms the buyers proposed based on valid documentation. And my attorney files it with the buyer's legal team and with the company, making it official, making it binding. And Raymond has 72 hours to sign or forfeit his stake entirely. And I don't tell him this directly. I let his attorney inform him. And I wait. And Friday afternoon I get confirmation. Raymond signed, his attorney transmitted the documents, and the deal moves forward under the corrected structure. 94.5 million for me, 79.8 million for Raymond. And the exit closes escrow within 2 weeks, and Raymond's authority ends immediately upon my signature. The buyers take board control. Raymond has no governance role, no decision-making power, nothing but his payout. And what's interesting is the buyers also clawed back certain provisions, advisory fees Raymond had built into the original deal, success bonuses for negotiating, consulting arrangements post-closing, and all of those disappear in the revised structure because the buyers say those were compensation for authority he didn't actually have, for negotiation he couldn't legally conduct alone. And his total take drops even further, from 79 million to 74 million. After those clawbacks. And I feel no sympathy, none. Because every clause he built to enrich himself beyond his equity was built on assumption of my compliance, and I didn't comply, and the structure collapsed. And when the wire transfers hit my account 2 weeks later, 94.5 million, I sit looking at the number, and it's not about the money really, it's about the principle, about not being erased, about maintaining authority over my own work, my own contribution, my own future. And Raymond's message pops up on my phone. 3 words, "Are you happy now?" And I don't respond. Because his question assumes this was about happiness, about revenge, about defeating him, but it was never about him. It was about me, about protecting what I built, about refusing to be diminished, and his inability to understand that proves how little he ever understood me. The $210 million deal closes 3 weeks after my signature. Buyers take possession, funds distribute to stakeholders, and Raymond's authority ends completely, immediately. And I hear from my sister that he's bitter, telling people I manipulated the process, that I destroyed family relationships for money, that I was always difficult, and this proves it. And I don't engage with his narrative. Don't defend myself. Don't try to correct the story he's telling, because people who want to understand already do, and people who prefer his version will believe it regardless. And what matters is the objective truth, the documented truth, that he restructured equity without proper consent, that he negotiated beyond his authority, that he built a deal structure designed to strip my governance rights, and when I enforced my legitimate consent rights, when I insisted on valid documentation, when I protected myself legally, the deal still happened. Everyone still got substantial payouts, just not the inflated shares Raymond promised based on equity he couldn't prove he owned. And my attorney tells me Raymond's compensation was clawed back even further. The buyers found additional advisory fees he'd embedded, additional bonuses he'd structured, and they removed all of it. And his final take was 71 million. Substantial, life-changing, but 40 million less than he'd announced. 40 million less than he'd counted on. And I think about him standing in his living room announcing a secured deal, announcing 210 million, calculating his share at 111. And I think about the gap between what he thought he'd engineered and what he actually received. And that gap exists because he'd built everything on a foundation of my assumed compliance. And assumptions aren't contracts. And I didn't assume anything. I read, I questioned, I enforced my rights. And the structure he built couldn't withstand actual scrutiny. And now he's bitter, angry, diminished in his own estimation. And I understand that's not my responsibility. I didn't diminish him. He diminished himself by overreaching, by assuming authority he didn't have, by treating my consent as a formality rather than a requirement. My marriage doesn't survive this process. Andrew and I separate quietly 6 weeks after closing. And it's not dramatic, not angry, just clear. I understand now that he sees me differently than I see myself. He sees someone who needs managing, someone whose questions are obstacles rather than insight, someone whose caution is anxiety rather than wisdom. And I can't be married to someone who fundamentally doesn't respect my judgment, who sides with family against me, who apologizes only after being proven wrong. And when I tell Andrew I want separation, he's not surprised. Says he knew this was coming. Says the deal process revealed fundamental differences between us, and I agree, and we divide assets cleanly, fairly. And he moves out, and I'm alone in our house, financially secure, emotionally clear, and I realize I'm not sad, I'm relieved. Because living with someone who doesn't see you accurately is exhausting, is diminishing, and I'm done being diminished. And my mother asks if I'm okay, asks if I need anything, and I tell her I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm myself for the first time in years. And she says she wishes things had been different, wishes the family hadn't split over this. And I tell her the family split long before this deal, split when Raymond started building his narrative, and everyone accepted it without question. Split when I became the difficult one for asking questions. And what happened with the acquisition just made the split visible. Didn't create it, revealed it. And she's quiet, and then she says, I should have trusted you. And I say, yes, and she says, will you forgive us? And I say, I already have. Forgiveness is easy, trust is hard, and trust has to be rebuilt slowly. And she nods, and we're both quiet, and I understand our relationship will be different going forward, more honest maybe, more careful definitely, and that's okay. Different isn't bad. Different is just real. Family gatherings feel different now. Holiday dinners, birthday celebrations. There's a distance that wasn't there before. Or maybe it was always there, but we're just acknowledging it now. And Raymond avoids eye contact, sits on the opposite side of rooms, leaves early, and nobody asks him to handle things anymore. Nobody defers to his authority. Nobody treats his version of events as gospel. And at Christmas dinner, someone suggests Raymond coordinate gifts, and my mother says no. Everyone manages their own. And it's a small thing, trivial even, but it's indicative of a larger shift. Raymond's role has changed. He's no longer the family authority, the decision maker, the person who handles things. He's just another family member, one among several. And I watch him struggle with this diminished position, watch him try to assert opinions that are now treated as just opinions, not directives. And it's not satisfying watching this, not pleasurable, just factual. His authority is gone, his credibility damaged, and it happened because he overreached, because he assumed too much, because he treated my consent as guaranteed. And I sit at these gatherings quiet and calm, not gloating, not resentful, just present. And when Raymond's wife asks if I'm happy with how everything turned out, I tell her the truth. I'm satisfied that accuracy prevailed, that documentation mattered, that consent requirements were enforced. And she looks confused, like she expected me to say I'm happy about the money. And I explain it was never about the money, it was about control, about not being erased, about maintaining authority over my own work. And she nods slowly, and I realize she doesn't understand, not really, but she's trying. And that's something, and silence replaces dominance at these gatherings. Nobody fills the space Raymond used to occupy. Nobody steps into his role. We're all just individuals now, equals, making our own decisions, speaking for ourselves, and it's uncomfortable sometimes. Quieter definitely, but more honest, more real. I close this story, sitting in my new office, smaller company, something I'm building alone this time. No partners, no family involvement, just me and hired talent. And I think about Raymond standing in his living room announcing a secured deal, announcing my signature as a formality, announcing $210 million like it was already counted and distributed. And I think about everything he didn't understand, didn't anticipate, didn't plan for. And what he missed was simple. He thought the deal was about money, about negotiating the highest number, about distributing wealth. But the deal was never about money. Not fundamentally. The deal was about control, about who had authority to make decisions, about whose consent mattered. And Raymond built a structure designed to transfer control to himself, to strip my voting rights, to eliminate my voice. And he thought I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't understand, or wouldn't object. And he was wrong about all of it. I noticed immediately. I understood completely, and I objected effectively, because control requires consent, real consent, documented consent, not assumed consent, not verbal approvals that were never given, not signatures that don't exist. And when I enforced my consent rights, when I insisted on valid documentation, when I refused to sign away authority over work I built, the entire structure Raymond created collapsed. And the deal still happened, the exit still closed, the money still transferred, but on terms that reflected reality, terms that honored actual equity, terms that preserved everyone's voice through closing. And Raymond ended up with substantial wealth, $71 million. But not the wealth he'd assumed, not the authority he'd claimed, not the control he'd engineered. And the difference between what he planned and what actually happened exists because he made one critical mistake. He assumed my compliance. And assumptions aren't binding. And I never promised anything. And signatures matter. They matter legally. They matter procedurally. They matter fundamentally. And my signature was never a formality. It was a requirement. It was a protection. It was power. And I used that power exactly as intended, to protect myself, to preserve my authority, to ensure fairness. And if that makes me difficult in Raymond's telling, if that makes me the villain in his story, I accept that designation. Because being difficult is better than being erased, being careful is better than being cheated, and being accurate is better than being compliant. And the signatures mattered. Every single one, especially mine, especially the ones I didn't give, especially the consent I withheld, until terms were right, until structure was fair, until my voice was protected. And that's the lesson here. The lesson Raymond never learned. That consent isn't something you assume, it's something you earn. And control isn't something you claim, it's something you're granted. And neither assumption nor contact with my actual signature, my actual authority, my actual refusal to be managed. And he said my signature was just a formality, but it was everything. It was the entire deal. It was the moment when reality met narrative and reality won.